All right. So before we begin really learning Sefer Shmuel, a few introductory remarks I think is necessary before we actually begin the text inside. First of all, it shouldn't, I want it to become clear about how unique this is. You think about it, it wouldn't be, if you think about there's a bunch of Jews getting together learning Navi, learning prophets, what's the big deal? The truth is, historically, this is something new. Because in the modern times, when I say modern, I mean from the 19th century till very recently, the studying of Tanakh really was very much neglected in the Jewish world. And within the frum Orthodox Jewish world, very much neglected. Chumash, not so much. Bible, not so much. Every kid went to school learning Chumash, the basic stories of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and so on. But as far as the prophets and writings are concerned, very much neglected. Some reasons somewhat legitimate, some reasons not so legitimate. That's just the reality. And only very recently, very recently, was there sort of a reawakening of a desire to learn Navi. And it's very much connected with the fact that we're coming closer to Mashiach. And there's no question about it that, learning Navi and reading and sort of, when a person learns Navi properly, sort of you're reliving these periods in Jewish history where we had our land, we had, autonomy, but in a much deeper sense and more important sense, we had prophecy. We had a very intimate connection with Hashem through prophecy, as we'll see clearly throughout the Sefer. And it wasn't just the fact that we had people going throughout the streets that knew the future. Mm-hmm. That's a very small part of what prophecy truly is about. Prophecy was a spirit that was running throughout the entire Jewish people, that intimate, very, very deeply intimate relationship with God that few people here and there grabbed onto in its most extreme form, to the point of where they were able to raise their consciousness literally above time and space, where they were, past, present, and future sort of became one. But those were people that excelled in that relationship. But this was a relationship between God and the Jewish people that was palpable throughout the entire people. And it's something that we're going to become very clear, and you could feel it when you read prophets well. And it's something that the Jewish people have been missing for a very long time. And again, as we get close to Mashiach, it's hard to say we're getting it back, but we're definitely getting the desire to have it back. And therefore with that comes a desire to learn Navi. So just even before we learn the text itself, I think it's just important to know what prophets are. So for example, we know that in Tanakh, again, some of these things might be obvious, I don't know, but I'm just going to start from, ground zero, because why not? Tanakh basically has three parts. There's Torah, right? 5 books of Moses, right? Then you have Nevi'im, the prophets, Joshua, Samuel, Judges, and so on, whatever. And then you have the writings, the Megillah Ruos, Tehillim, Song of Songs, all those things. So right off the bat, just to know, and it's important to have this clear, because as we are about to learn, it's important just to know this beforehand. What book? Who decided that what book goes in what category? Right? It can't be a historical thing, because, for example, the person who wrote Sefer Shmuel, who wrote the book of Samuel, so it was Shmuel. Shmuel wrote the book of Samuel. He also was the author of Megillah Ruth, the book of Ruth. So the one author writes one book, which are both historical events, both historical chronicles of the Jewish people. One is in prophets and one's in writings. What's the difference between the two? This is a very, very important Gemara in Bava Basra. Gemara tells us this is the basic premise, even before you learn how to know what's going on. The Gemara tells us that there's basically 3 levels of communication between God and human being. There's 3 basic levels. The highest and most extreme level was attained by only one person in Jewish history, which was Moshe Rabbeinu. The level of prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu's level of prophecy, the prophecy that the pasuk that Torah describes to be face to face with God, such a communication, that was a level that only Moshe Rabbeinu attained.
Really? Even Adam Harishon didn't?
Yeah, Adam Rishon before the sin, it's really, we don't really know much about that relationship. But what we have recorded in Chumash is definitely through Moshe Rabbeinu. As far as post, modern man, post sin, the only man in all of history, both past and future, that reached that level of communication with God, face to face, what's called, is Moshe Rabbeinu. Any prophecy that was experienced, any communication that was experienced on that level becomes Torah. That's the 5 books of Moses. So what makes Chumash, it's not the fact that whatever happened in that period of Jewish history. It's not about the historical events. And any information that was conveyed with that level of prophecy automatically becomes Torah. That's called Chumash. Like I said, no human being ever experienced that before or after. Now, the next step down from that high level of experience is your run-of-the-mill average prophet, right? Which is pretty good, but it's your run-of-the-mill average prophet. It's the prophecies that Joshua experienced, that King David experienced, that Solomon, the run-of-the-mill prophecies. The average prophecy, which, again, that level of communication between God and human being, one step down from Moses, that is transcribed, that becomes Nevi'im, that becomes prophets. So, for example, this book that we're about to read, every single word in this book, and again, anything written in Navi, in prophets, was said over from God to the prophet, whichever prophet it was, with a level of prophecy. Not to the extreme of Moshe Rabbeinu, but a real true prophecy.
Malachim is part of...
Malachim is part of prophets, yeah, it's part of prophets.
But Malachim seems to be like more reads like a more
so
historical...
Yes, like I said, that's what's important also. Every part of Nevi'im, despite the fact that it seems just to be chronicling history, we're going to see very, very clearly that the Navi, the prophet, not only, it's true that he is trying to convey history, there's no question about it, but not all historical events are recorded. And we're going to see the way it's worded is in such a way, there's a lesson in each and every aspect of it. The main point of it was not to convey history. The main point of it was to record this communication between God and the prophet for whatever reason, and it's for us to learn from each and every step of the way. That's the definition of that. Now, just by the way, just on the side, well, what's the difference between the average prophecy level and the level of Moshe Rabbeinu? So one of the main differences was the following way. See, when a prophet, when you think of how did a prophet look like when he received a vision? So, I don't know, I picked up the phone, whatever it is, and he got a call from God, he had like the bat phone, he just picked it up, whatever, or he's walking down the street, he just, God talks to him. It's not like that. It was actually a very, very traumatic experience, physically traumatic. Our tradition is that when a prophet experienced a prophecy, he would go into convulsions, his body would start shaking violently. It was a very physically draining experience because that level of attachment of the soul to God, the physical body with the ego and the consciousness of the human being, was very hard for it to tolerate such an experience. Because when a person if you think about it, when a person, allows his soul to attach itself to God on such a level, then a person's ego has to be stripped away. The person's physicality can't get in the way of that. So in order to allow this high level of communication between a human being and God, the body has to be sort of nullified. So this is what would happen. That you would be physically traumatic, very physically traumatic. That's what would take place. Moshe Rabbeinu
would be asleep, like a nested time. Like
so
Abraham was put to
yeah, that's what. Yeah, more often than not, it was done at night when they were unconscious anyway. So the body was sort of quieted down. You're right, and we know this. The Barbanel talks with this as well. Even if it happened during the day, but in order for it to happen, they would definitely have to put themselves in an unconscious state, either through meditation or just when it was the time, God would put them under. But even when it happened, the Ramchal says that if you saw a prophet experiencing a prophecy at that moment, you would see his body mama shaking. He would look like he was in serious trauma, and he was. It was a serious thing. And only therefore, the Rambam writes this, that only therefore, one of the stipulations for prophecy was the person had to be physically healthy. If a person wasn't physically healthy, then he wouldn't be able to get through that experience. And therefore it was necessary, besides him being spiritually healthy, obviously, he also had to be physically well. Not only that, he also had to be financially well also, because having the burden, constantly thinking, worrying about how you're gonna pay the next bill, it weighed on the person to the point that he wasn't able to handle the traumatic experience of prophecy. So everything had to sort of be okay. Moshe Rabbeinu was not like that. Moshe Rabbeinu refined himself to such an extent where even his ego and his consciousness and his physical body didn't get in the way of his prophetic experience. So Moshe Rabbeinu, therefore, the pasuk describes Moshe Rabbeinu was awake and alert when he communicated with God face to face. That means that he refined himself, and so if you think about it, it's such an unbelievably high level, that he refined himself to such a degree where his soul was able to communicate directly with God, and his body, while still being physically alert, did not act in the slightest way as a barrier between the two. That's how refined his body was. In fact, Chazal say an unbelievable thing. The Gemara, the Medrash tells us that the time when the time came for Moshe Rabbeinu to pass away, so Hashem told the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu, it's time to come home. So the soul said, Moshe Rabbeinu's soul told Hashem, he said, why? I'm with you up there, I'm with you down here. To me it's all the same. So Hashem said, okay, I hear you, but listen, it's time. So I said, okay, fine. You want me to come home? I'll come home. Whatever. But to me, it's all the same. That's the refinement that Moshe Rabbeinu reached. It's an unbelievable thing, and that level of refinement, the pasuk says, never happened and never will happen until the resurrection of the dead. That's an unbelievably high level. So, like I said, that level of communication where the body and the ego and the consciousness wasn't an interference at all. That level of clairvoyance, that level of clarity. Anytime that level was transmitted, that becomes chumash. And again, that's the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. The average prophet, whose body and consciousness did get in the way, and therefore had to sort of be shut down to allow the communication to get through, that becomes writings. That becomes prophets. Now, what becomes ksuvim? So ksuvim is anything that was transmitted from a lower level of prophecy, what's called ruach hakodesh, or what we call divine inspiration. What does that mean? So that means, like I said, for let's say Shmuel in this case. So Samuel is if he's experiencing true prophecy, so like I said, you'll be able to tell right away. He's unconscious, he's shaking violently, very traumatic, his eyes are rolling back in his head, something's not right. So he's being given visions in true prophetic form. Other times, however, the same person, Shmuel, will be walking down the street, certain ideas would pop into his head, he would know that these ideas were not things that he was working on, not things that he was struggling to understand, just ideas that popped into his head, and he knew deep down it's coming from a higher place. Those ideas, that's called divine inspiration. So it's a much lower level of communication between God and man. It's not the violent, clear, direct communication of prophecy. It's indirect. It's Hashem working through the human mind, but the person knows that it's coming from a higher place. Now that last lower level, called divine inspiration, we could all really experience on different, to a certain extent. When a person, again, it's even on the simplest thing, the person's walking down the street, isn't doing anything to prepare himself for this, but just an idea of Torah pops into his head, or just a moment of inspiration, whatever the case may be. That's a little taste of divine inspiration. Maybe it's not the level that maybe these people experience, but it's a taste of it. That's a taste of it. That's what the Gemara says, that even though prophecy, true prophecy, sort of hasn't been around since the destruction of the first temple, but divine inspiration, that's something we could all have. In fact, the great tzaddikim experienced that when they walk down the street. They overhear a conversation from random people. They see that as God's communicating something to them, and they learn a lesson from that. That's called divine inspiration. So that's something. So for example, if Shmuel was walking down the street, Sam was walking down the street, and one of these ideas pops into his head, and he knows in his heart that this is not from me, this is coming from a higher place. That's called divine inspiration. That becomes writings. So, for example, the book of Ruth. So Shmuel wrote the book of Ruth not while he's having convulses and not while he's unconscious. He's sitting down, dining room table, pen and paper, using his own mind to record the history, the family of King David, and that's called the book of Ruth. But while he's doing this, he knows this is not really me. He knows that it's not really me. It's really God speaking through my mind, through my pen, and he knows that. Doesn't look like it, doesn't feel like it, but he knows that. Therefore, that becomes writings. See, that's why, in Jewish history, now we take it for granted that we have Tanakh. But the truth is, throughout Jewish history, there were certain books in Tanakh, which were very controversial, whether they should be included or not. Because it wasn't just, for example, like everyone knew King Solomon, who's greater than King Solomon. But there were certain books that he wrote, which were very questionable, whether it's Torah, it's nice information, but does it officially go into the category of divine inspiration to be recorded, to be considered, codified in Tanakh? It's not so simple.
Like what?
So, for example, I'll give you an example. So, first of all, Kehelas. I don't know how they translate Kehelas. Whatever, yeah, that word. So that was not so simple. That was not so simple. In fact, the Gemara says that one of the main problems that people had with Kehelas was the fact that there's a lot of contradictions within it. So it was a little bit. So some of the Chachamim, some of the rabbis were a little bit questionable about it. They knew the author, and they knew the author was Shlomo Melech, but when he sat down to write Kehelas, did he write it with divine inspiration or not? It's not clear. So in fact, the Gemara tells us a fascinating thing. The Gemara says that there was a certain Tana, I think his name was like Chizkiyo, something, I can't remember 100% the name, but he decided that he's gonna solve the question, once and for all. The Gemara says that he was I think it was in Tiberia. He took 400 barrels of wine, brought it up to an attic in some house over there, and sat there and used the oil to to 400 barrels of oil. I'm sorry, and that would be a different story. 400 barrels of oil to use as a lamp. And he sat there day and night until he solved all the contradictions within Kehelas, and then it became accepted that Kehelas should be part of Tanakh. Another example that was very questionable was the Book of Esther. Book of Esther it was a very big question. It's a very big question. Should it be part of Tanakh? And again, there's no question. The author Mordechai, a big tzaddik, there's no question about it that he was unbelievable. But again, when he sat down to write the Book of Esther, was it written just as a human being on Mordechai's stature writing the recorded history, or was this divine inspiration? Again, it was questionable. It became clarified throughout history that yes, it was. But again, these were debatable points. Mm-hmm. Another book that was very questionable was Song of Songs, Shir Hashirim. Again, authored by Shlomo. There's no question about the author, but this book itself, what is it? Another, so Shir Hashirim was also questionable because of the content, because it doesn't read like the usual book in Tanakh. It's not the historical, that's for sure, and it's not even Tehillim, which is clearly mentioning God. Shir Hashirim doesn't mention God's name at all. It's not clearly talking about anything more than what it sounds like. So this was a questionable thing. They all knew. See, all the Chachamim knew what Shir Hashirim was talking about, but the question was twofold: was it written with divine inspiration, and should we put such a thing in Tanakh? So again, that as well was a questionable point. It wasn't so simple until Rabbi Kiva got up, and Rabbi Kiva firmly said, with great conviction, that all songs are holy, but Song of Songs is a holy of holy. In other words, that he decided, and everyone followed him, that yes, not only is it with divine inspiration, but it's deserving to be put in Tanakh. And not only is it deserving, it's considered one of the holiest books of Tanakh. So that's what, these things were debatable. Because again, that's why there are many Jewish books that were written during the time period of Tanakh by big people that could be learned, and it's good stuff, but it's just not Tanakh. It's not Tanakh. And in fact, that's why, there's a very fascinating theory that was posed by Rav Ruvi Margolius. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was the head librarian in Hebrew University in like the 30s, or I don't know when, it's maybe a little bit later than that, whatever, like the 50s or so. A huge genius. He's one of these guys that just had a photographic memory. Anything he ever saw, he remembered. One of these brilliant people. So he suggested the following theory. It's a fascinating idea. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin that Chazal made a very serious very serious proclamation about anyone against people who read Svarim Chitzonim, or literally translated as books from the outside. Books from the outside. So what does that mean, Svarim Chitzonim? So the Gemara talks about that. So the most commonly accepted interpretation of Svarim Chitzonim means like Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy, because in those days that was a very attractive thing for whatever reason, and the Aristotelian thought and these types of things, and would cause Jews to have problems with faith, and therefore Chazal said it's better not to get involved. The Gemara does say that if a person's old enough and wise enough, then it's fine. But as far as the average person who isn't well grounded in Torah, to then start dabbling in these other things is dangerous. That's what the common accepted approach is. Rav Ruvi Margolius, using sources obviously, he suggests the following idea, that what was included at least in these outer books were other books written during the time period of Tanakh by holy Jews, but Chazal made a decree that one should not read them. Why? But he makes the following theory. He says because at the time where Chazal were talking about, when they made this decree not to read those books, that was at the time where Chazal finally sort of sat down and clarified what the 24 books of Tanakh were. And so in order to sort of solidify that in the Jewish people's consciousness, that these are our books, and outside of these books is not Tanakh, they made a decree, at least for X amount of time, that one should not read any outside book. Not so much because there's something wrong with those books, but just in order to concretize in people's minds that these books are special, and the outside books are outside, so they made that decree. That was his theory that he proposed. And again, it's an interesting idea, but again, that's it's just an interesting thought. But that's what it's important to remember, what Tanakh is. So there's no question that when you read it, it's definitely a lot of Jewish history, 100%, and there's a lot of lessons as well. But it's just important to remember that means every single word that we read, when we let's say specifically Sefer Shmuel, these are words that were communicated by Hashem to the prophet in its in the most in its real true form of prophecy, and that's something that is important to know. That's why it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. Whenever Chumash, for example, right, or Navi, when it records people talking, is it quoting verbatim? Like, for example, I mean, we're going to get to even in, I think in this week's parsha we have Pharaoh yet in this week's parsha. Yeah, we have Pharaoh talking to Joseph and all these things. So Pharaoh didn't speak Hebrew, right? That's no question. Pharaoh spoke with such poetic language that Chumash records him as speaking with, or like we're going to read these stories. I mean, people spoke. I mean, does that mean that the Torah is quoting verbatim? If it's a historical book and the purpose of it is historical accuracy, then it should be recording as much as verbatim as possible. But the truth is, it's really not like that. There's many proofs to show that when Tanakh quotes people, it's not verbatim. There was no question that the concept was what the person was trying to give over, but the wordage that the Torah uses, or the prophet uses, that was Hashem's words that he conveyed to the prophet to express. Again, as whatever he's trying to say over from the person. So, for example, Pharaoh says XYZ, he might have not said XYZ. The wording, the concept of XYZ he was trying to convey, but the words itself, he might have used other words. The prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu, whoever the case may be, was given from God these words to say over to convey Pharaoh's idea. Which is why it's a funny thing, like a lot of times you have Gemaras that, delve so deeply into certain phrases that were said by, like a random person, like, Bilam, who's like a no-goodnik. The wording that he said this, why didn't he say that word? Who cares? Whatever, he's just a guy. He just says words that he says. The answer is that no, because the words that we see from Chumash that Torah tells us he said, the wordings themselves, that was really God. He's trying to convey what Bilam said, the concept that Bilam said over, but the words themselves is from God. So again, it's an important thing to remember, that it's not just a history thing, it's really God communicating. That's all, I guess, introduction number one. Another point that I just want to say over again before we really get involved in it. By the way, if there's any questions, then please feel free. It doesn't have to be constantly talking. I hear myself enough. So if you guys want to, that's also fine.
I'm going to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah.
Moshe Rabbeinu talked to Paro. He had these conversations, everything.
Yeah.
In whatever language they were obviously
right.
they were using.
Right, because we know Pharaoh didn't speak Hebrew, that's for sure.
Right, but I'm saying, but also Moshe Rabbeinu spoke Egyptian, so we could speak to him with whatever language he wanted to speak to him.
Right.
And he was recording in Hebrew.
Right, so I'm saying it's not just a translation. It's also, whatever, I don't know what the word is.
Right, okay, but he's conscious.
When he's speaking to Pharaoh,
He's conscious when he's speaking to God.
Yeah.
He's conscious when he's writing these things. He's aware of what he's writing. He knows what he's writing. And it's
100%.
Whatever kind of Hebrew or something. It's don't call it a translation, but call it conceptually whatever it is that went on there.
Yeah.
So when that's unique. That's Moshe Rabbeinu.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have a Navi. Who is not conscious necessarily and is having some kind of near-death experience and communicating in some way, and then he comes to and he starts to write.
So now what happens?
Right, so he's writing based upon...
so that's a good question. So there are different types of visions. That's the truth. There are different types of visions. For the Rambam talks about this in his Guide to Perplexed, other Rishonim as well. For the most part, when a prophet experienced a vision, what was seen to him, we call it a vision, but surely that went along with the vision was the actual wordage itself that he was supposed to communicate over to the Jewish people. So, for example, when Shmuel, again, had this prophetic experience and he wrote down the book of Samuel, in the vision itself, these words were put in his head. Okay? Sometimes it was just the words. Sometimes it was a picture, a physical picture that went along with the words. Sometimes it was just a physical picture, and sort of the meaning of the picture was also implanted in his head. So that's why, so it depends. So when he woke up and he transmitted the information that he was given, so he was conscious when he was writing it, and then he wasn't having a prophetic experience anymore. But what he was transcribing was exactly the experience itself. Again, for the most part, like I said, the words, the paragraphs, the sentences were that's what he saw.
Right. So as Moshe Rabbeinu was, in a sense, instructed by Hashem, word for word, what you're putting down. are we also to presume then the Navi, in whatever he was experienced, was also instructed?
So that's a very good question as well, because and that's true. Anything that we see, I'll tell you like this. The Gemara in fact tells us that throughout Jewish history, we've had more than 1.5 million prophets. 1.5 million prophets, that's a lot. In Tanakh, all we have recorded are 48. 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses. That's all we have recorded in Tanakh. But in fact, the Gemara says we had over 1.5 million. How does that work?
Meidad and
Eldad and Meidad, right. At least they're mentioned, right? But we don't. Yeah, exactly. So even though we have a tradition of what their prophecy was, but it's definitely not recorded in Tanakh. So in fact, the way it's explained is that you're right. The average prophet that of the 1.5 million that experienced prophecy, what they experienced in their vision was something personal to them, or maybe it was something current to that generation. But it was never in the vision. It was never told to them in the vision, say this over and record it for all time. That was not part of it, and therefore all the visions, that overwhelming majority of prophetic visions that the Jewish people have experienced, with these prophets, are not recorded at all. Because, like I said, it wasn't given over in such a way. Any prophecy that we have recorded that became part of Tanakh with the vision, like you said, with the vision came the commandment and the clarity that this is something that's necessary for all generations to know, and make sure to write it down. And at some point, then it became collected and it became formulated into Tanakh. But you're right. Part of the vision came with that sort of commandment to do that. Again, the difference is that when Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was physically writing Chumash, he was having the transmission at the same moment. The average prophet was not. But when the average prophet did experience that, along with the information was, this is necessary for all time, And again, like I said, some of these things is question. Why is this necessary for all time? So we'll have to work through that to figure out how this is current. But that's definitely true. That's why it's an amazing thing that when we had prophets, people would go to them for random things. Like we'll see later on in the book of Samuel that people went. For example, when King Saul, before he became king, it's a quick story. King Saul, he lost his father's flock. He was taking care of the flock. They ran away, whatever. He lost it. So he said, what? Let's go to the prophet. Let's ask him where our sheep is, where his sheep are, whatever. You're going to waste his time. Yeah, that was part of his deal. That was part of his job. He had clairvoyance. He had these visions, and my sheep are important. So maybe he'll be able to tell me where it is. So that's just an important thing. But you're right. The overwhelming majority of prophetic experiences were either personal or necessary for that generation. But that was it. That was it. Only the ones that we have recorded, those 48 prophets, only their visions were necessary for all time. And that's what we have recorded. But again, like I said, it's important to remember these were not individual. These were not random experiences. This was a prophecy It was something that was pervasive throughout the entire generation,
But not everybody wrote it down.
Not everyone wrote it down. And there were some that did, but as far as being recorded in Tanakh, only these 48.
Okay, so there do exist other...
I don't know. I don't know if they still exist, but it is possible that someone... I'm sure someone would... If God spoke to me, I'd like to take a note of it, so that I don't forget it. I'm sure that at some point someone did.
Kind of
yeah, I'm sure it was. But it was not saved in the collective Jewish writings because it was not going to be considered part of Tanakh unless it was supposed to be, But it was not. Again, like I said, the person himself might have made a recording of it. That's highly possible, highly probable. But it wasn't saved. It wasn't saved. They didn't have computer. That you couldn't just upload it on Google or something. It didn't work like that. So yeah, it's one of those things. Fine. And there's another. Again, if there's any points we could go on further. Are we good?
My questions probably should be waited until later, but I don't know if you want to address it now. We're almost on Hanukkah.
Yeah.
So this has been a big thing for me my whole life. It's everything you just described excludes the entire story of Hanukkah.
Yeah.
All the books of the Maccabees were just created.
Yeah.
You're out.
Yeah.
Yet we still have this holiday embedded in the tradition, and now we have one holiday, unlike any other, that is in our tradition that has no divine 100%. Connection to even the Book of Ruth, even the Book of Esther.
Yeah. There's something.
Holidays.
That's what's very unique about Hanukkah.
It's always you want.
So just
somebody to address that.
No, 100%. I could if you want. See, it's just to gain a little perspective. When did prophecy end? As far as we know it.
If I understand you right, when you say when did prophecy end, you're saying when did prophecy that affects all time?
Not only that, and any true prophecy. Forget affecting all time, even for that person. When did true prophecy end? When was the last time a person went unconscious and had this traumatic experience where God was literally communicating with him? Whether the communication was something for all time necessary or not, whatever. When was the last time that happened? So the truth is, to be fair, like anything in Judaism, the answer is it's a disagreement. That's really the truth. It's not so simple. In fact, I'll tell you very quickly, nowhere in the Rambam's writings, it's a fascinating thing, nowhere in the Rambam's writings does he ever say that one cannot experience prophecy nowadays. Never says such a thing. What the Rambam does say in his Guide to the Perplexed is that it is highly, highly unlikely for a person to experience prophecy nowadays because of a very interesting reason. He says the reason is because in order to experience prophecy, one has to be in a very high state of simcha. And he says it's highly unlikely, I should say, for a person to experience simcha in exile. Very unlikely. Is it impossible? It's not impossible, it's just highly unlikely. And that's the reason, practically, says the Rambam, why we don't see prophets walking down the street.
That's why it's been given for fools and kids.
Yeah, that's what Gemara says, right? Because they don't feel the stress of exile. That's true. That's what Rambam says. And in fact, there was a very controversial figure in Jewish history, whereby the Kabbalists, he's still considered to be, he's still questionable. His writings are considered to be authoritative, but his name was Rav Abulafia. Rav Abulafia lived in the 1200s. Fascinating personality. He was a contemporary. He was a Kabbalist, very much involved in meditative Kabbalah, and it's just a fascinating life. He, in fact, in a lot of his writings, he says about himself that he experienced Nevuah, right? Which right away you say that was just a huge controversial thing. And in fact, the leading posek of the generation at his time was the Rashba, Rav Shalom ben Adaras, who to this day is considered one of the greatest authorities of all time in halacha. He got word of this person, Rav Abulafia, who's claiming to be a prophet. He wrote letters to all of the rabbis in Spain that we should excommunicate him, shun him. It's terrible what this guy is doing.
Spain
the Rashba was the chief rabbi of Spain.
And
Abulafia was also in Spain, like more of a little city. I remember maybe it was in Barcelona. Not Barcelona, it was a major place. It was a small little thing. Anyway, and he eventually made his way to Italy, the whole thing. So the Rashba, excommunicated him, and anything the Rashba said, that was it. I mean, the entire Jewish world, at least the Sephardi Jewish world, that was it. The Rashba says, jump, you ask how high. That's just the way it was. And so it would be interesting. You would think that Rav Abulafia's writings would be sort of thrown into the dustbin of Jewish history, but it's really not. The Kabbalists still took his writings very seriously, despite the fact that maybe as a person, like, there's some weird things about his life. For example, he went on a whole mission to convert the Pope. It's just a fascinating... No, it sounds like crazy, but in one of his visions, he believed that he was told that he had to go convert the Pope as a messianic thing, and that's what he tried to do that. He wasn't the first person to do that, by the way, to try. There was a person later on in history who tried the same thing, had a tragic end to him.
Who was he saying?
Now, I'll tell you in a second. This is Rabbi Abulafia, so he traveled to Italy to do this. And in fact, it didn't work out because the Pope, it didn't work out. But the Pope suddenly fell ill. He caught like pneumonia or something, and he passed away before Rabbi had a chance to talk to him. But he actually had a meeting. He had a scheduled meeting with the Pope. It just didn't work out because the Pope passed away. Later on in history, during the time period of the Arizal, a little bit before, there was someone by the name of Shlomo Molcho, who also at the same...
With David Haruveni together, I think they...
Yeah, so he also tried. Yeah, not only that, so he was burnt at the stake because of what he tried to do, and he's held in high esteem by Mekubalim as far as his, righteousness is concerned. That was Rav Abulafia. This is a fascinating thing. But again, the fact that the Kabbalists always held his writings to be in high esteem. I'll tell you a fascinating thing on the side. One of the parts of the writings of Arizal is something called Shari Kedusha, the gates of holiness. So Shari Kedusha is about prophecy. It's about how to experience prophecy. What do you need to do to get to become a prophet, to experience divine inspiration, and so on. So most of it is basically like very technical stuff and the higher world, and how to sort of weave your way over there once you're up there. The last chapter, Rav Chaim Vital writes in his introduction to the last chapter that this last chapter is going to be the practical guide how to do it, and here we go. Now, if you have a Sha'ar Kedusha at home, you open the last chapter, you have that title that like, okay, here we go, and there's a blank paper. So what's going on? So the editor...
It costs extra for that.
It costs extra, right? Yeah, a little bit more now. So the way it is that the editor writes, he says that this last chapter is mostly divine names, and therefore it's not befitting to print it, for the masses. That's what it says. Now, truth is, if you have the manuscript, you'll see that it's not mostly divine names. It's as much divine names as other parts of the Arizal. What's so controversial about that? So what's he talking about? If you look into it, a lot of it is basically cut and pasted from the writings of Rabbi Avraham Abulafia. So what's very likely is that the editor, there's politics going on with that, the editor, because of the controversial person, Rabbi Abulafia, it's best not to print this last chapter. It's just a fascinating thing. Therefore, going a little bit further in history, the Chida, Chaim Yosef David Azula, he lived in the 1700s, one of the great Sephardi poskim, Sephardi authorities on all things really of all time. He said when he wrote a fascinating book, biographical book on just random people called Shem HaGedolim. So there he has a little chapter sort of on Rabbi Avraham Abulafia, and he says at the end of it, he says despite some of the craziness that went on in his life, but the Chida says himself that I've seen some of the greatest Kabbalists of the generation study his Sfarim. So it's already been accepted. His writings are okay. So going back, why am I talking about this? So Rav Abulafia, like I said, one of the biggest controversial things he did was to claim that he experienced prophecy. The Rashba said it's impossible. We don't have prophets anymore. According to the opinion of the Rambam, it's not crazy. It's unlikely that we have prophecy nowadays, but you can't say it's impossible. You can't say it's impossible. That's the opinion of the Rambam. The prophecy technically is possible. However, the Rashba, most authorities disagree and say that true prophecy was dependent on there being a temple, number one, and number two, more importantly, the Ark of the Covenant being in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. Without that, true prophecy cannot be experienced. We'll see about that later on. Actually, in fact, in the book of Shmuel itself, there are hints to this, that you need the Ark of the Covenant to be in the temple in order to have prophecy happen. That was sort of seen as, that physical object itself was seen as sort of a conduit for communication.
At that time, the temple doesn't have to be in Jerusalem because at that time it was
Shiloh, right. Before the temple was built by Solomon, so you had tabernacles, but at least whatever it was,
it would work
that's fine. Right, that's fine. But as long as the Aron is in its proper place, wherever time period you are. But once the Aron was lost, or whatever, once it's not there anymore with the destruction of the first temple, true prophecy was gone. So that's really the end of prophecy. Now Hanukkah took place in the second temple. There's no more prophecy anymore. So that's why we have all these books, like you said, the books of the Chashmonaim, all that stuff, written by very nice Jews, very smart Jews, and it would be nice to know what they felt about things. But it wasn't said with prophecy, and even with the level of divine inspiration, it wasn't. Therefore, it's not a Tanakh. What's unique about Hanukkah is that that's a holiday that's completely rabbinic, like altogether rabbinic. There's not even, there's nothing, prophetic. It's completely rabbinic. That's why Hanukkah, it's the most beautiful thing. It's celebrating our ability to communicate with God sort of indirectly. That's what really the oral Torah is about. See, the difference between the oral Torah and the written Torah is not that, when the average person, you ask an average person, what's the difference between the oral Torah and the written Torah? It's very simple. The written Torah is what God told us. The oral Torah is what we made up. That's completely not true. The oral Torah is also what God told us. The difference is God has different ways of communicating. Written Torah, God communicated direct, either the level of Moshe, the level of a prophet, or even the level of divine inspiration. Torah Sheba'al Peh is also God communicating, but it's God communicating through human logic, through human effort, and in a way that's unbeknown to the human. That's what Torah Sheba'al Peh is about. So therefore, Hanukkah is a beautiful holiday. It's celebrating the fact that Hashem still communicates with us, despite the fact that He doesn't seem to, that He doesn't openly say so. That's what Hanukkah was about, that we didn't deserve it, and it was this miracle that happened amongst this craziness of the temple, the Greeks and all that stuff, where it's just all about Greek philosophy, intellect, human ability, human form, human beauty, and in the middle of that, God gives us a little Hanukkah present, that it might seem like you guys are functioning on your own, that it's all about you, it's all about the human psyche and human intellect. Just know that I'm still talking to you, and I'm still there, and everything you're coming up with, it's from me. It's just, for whatever reason, I'm not openly communicating this with you. It's like when you have a kid, let's say, a mother's like baking a cake or something, and she has a little girl helping her. quote unquote helping her. So the mother's making the cake, and the last when she pours the thing of dough into the bowl, so the little girl's holding on the edge of it, and the little girl says, "Oh, I made a cake," and the mother says, "Yeah, oh, you made the cake." Did she make the cake? No, she didn't make the cake. The mother made the cake, but the mother, in her kindness, wants the child to develop their own sense of accomplishment and confidence. So the mother makes in such a way where the child thinks she made the cake. That's what Torah Sheba'al Peh is. That's what oral Torah is. It's not, the same. It's the same God that communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's the same God communicating to Rabbi Kiva. The difference is Moshe Rabbeinu knew it, Rabbi Kiva didn't. And that's what Hashem wanted, because Hashem wants the Jewish people to feel like we're accomplishing, but not in a game, but in a real way, that we should develop, and we should develop our own skills and our ability. But we have to know, that's what Chanukah is celebrating, that we have to know that God is still communicating with us through human consciousness. That's what's unique about Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's what Torah Sheba'al was. That's why it's an amazing thing. Chanukah is one of those holidays where it doesn't matter what level of affiliation a Jew has or doesn't have. You always see Chanukah candles. So, okay, you'll ask the average sociologist, why? Yeah, listen, they have their, lights up, so Jews want to feel like we have something too. But the depth of it is much more than that. It's a beautiful thing that even Jews that don't feel connected at all still celebrate Hanukkah. Means that even there, on some deep subconscious level, they are celebrating the fact that even though God doesn't speak to us openly, God is still with us. And that's a beautiful thing. So Hanukkah, because it was established in such a time period, post-prophecy, that just adds to its beauty, because it's celebrating the fact that prophecy, to a certain extent, did not really end. It means God's communicating with us just from behind a mask of this world, a mask of human effort, which is an important thing to keep in mind. That's the beauty of Hanukkah. I don't know how long we're supposed to be going, by the way. I don't know. I'm just going to keep on going unless someone tells me not to. But I don't know how we're holding, but.
Let's finish the introduction.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. So one last thing before we close up shop. When we get specifically to this book of Samuel, so I think it's important just to give a little bit of a historical perspective of what this book is about in particular. So just history. We know that we left Egypt. 40 years we're in the desert, and then we entered the land of Israel. All right, with Joshua. Now, from that point on until the book of Samuel, we have a few hundred years. Okay, a few hundred years. That's basically what was taking place then. It was a very chaotic and turbulent time in Jewish history, those few hundred years. Samuel sort of gave us stability. Okay, but for those few hundred years, it's very unstable. You had very different leaders popping up in different time periods. More often than not, the Jewish people were dealing with surrounding nations, surrounding countries that were, harassing us, causing us problems. And every single situation, a new leader would pop up to help us out in that situation, and these leaders were generally good.
Who wrote Shoftim?
So Shoftim, I think Shoftim was also written by Shmuel. Okay. I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. So he wrote a number of books. Like Yirmiyahu also wrote. There's a few things. So anyway, throughout that period, so we had Shoftim, we had judges, and there was no true kingdom. Sometimes you had a judge over a certain part of the country and another judge over another part of the country. These people, some of them were the religious leaders as well, besides being the political leaders. Sometimes they weren't. They were all good Jews, obviously helping the Jewish people, there's no question, but they were on different levels. Shmuel comes those were the few hundred years. Shmuel comes as sort of the last judge, okay? And the main thing that he did was twofold. He stabilized the Jewish people. He was a judge that the entire Jewish people accepted, and there was unquestioned that he was the leader. Okay, and he also, one of the greatest gifts that he gave us is at the end of the book, he anoints King David. Okay, he anoints King David to be the king, and he's the bridge between that chaotic world of judges, of things just one judge taking over after the other and so on, to give us royalty, to give us malchus and stability and a true kingdom. That was one of the biggest gifts that Shmuel gave us was David Melech was kingdom itself.
Why is it he's critical when people ask him? He doesn't like this.
We'll have to get there. When we get there, we'll talk about that. Yeah, it was a turbulent time as well. In the transition from Shmuel to Kings, it was not a simple thing as well. But that's one of the things that he gave us. Another unique thing about Shmuel is that the fact that he was the political leader, he was the military leader, and he was the prophet. He was all rolled in one. It's a very interesting thing. We'll see throughout the book that he served. I'll tell you like this: when we think of the classic Rebbe-student relationship, So that's that's a relationship which is based on learning. Like the rabbi has certain intellectual knowledge and he conveys over to his students. It's a very understandable relationship. Then you look at Hasidim, right? So Hasidim, the relationship between a Chassid and a Rebbe is very different. It's not so much about intellectual transmission, but it's more of, they go to the Rebbe, they talk about their business, they talk about their kids' health, they talk about whatever. It's just sort of the father, the halachic guy, it's just like an interesting relationship. We're going to see that model of Chassid to Rebbe, that was a relationship that Shmuel had with the people. People would go to him not just for halachic questions, they would go to him for guidance in all things. And that was the role. So Chassidus, what Chassidus did when they brought back, when they created this idea of the Rebbe, it wasn't something new. They were bringing back the prophet-people relationship. We're going to see that very clearly. It's a fascinating thing that once prophecy ended, leadership was always rabbi-student, and that was very, very much intellectual. But before prophecy ended, during prophecy, it was more Chassid Rebbe. We're going to see that very clearly. It's a fascinating thing to see. So it's again, I guess that's sort of the end of the introduction. And, next time we'll hopefully dive right in. Okay.